Started, folks can just trickle in and grab food. I don't want to miss time with our presenter. So welcome to the law school and to the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracies. Next talk of our semester, our first academic talk by Professor Luke Foster. Phil Pinnell is going to do a full and appropriate introduction of Professor Foster in just a moment. I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the center and alert you to a couple of events we have coming up. For those of you who are undergraduate students, know that we just opened up our annual essay competition. We give out 3 scholarship awards in the amount of $2,500, $1,500, and $1,000 for the winner of that only 1,000-word essay contest. This year's topic is whether there should be limits to presidential pardons. That's a fun one. And hopefully you will think about writing something. Submissions are due March 11th. You can upload your submissions on our website. Check that event, the website out for a full list of events. One more, I will flag our Catholic Social and Political Thought Initiative begins its spring semester reading group tomorrow night in this room. There will be pizza and a conversation every other Tuesday for the remainder of the semester on Jacques Maritain's Man and the State. There will be free copies of the book available. So if you're interested, check it out and come on in. With no further ado, I will turn it over to Phil Pinnell to introduce Professor Foster.
Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you for giving up part of your Monday to come be here today. If you haven't already, free food in the back. Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You're going to have the illusion of a free lunch. Go ahead and pick your sandwich. My name is Philip Pinnell, and I'm a graduate fellow for the Center at the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy.
Louder, Phil.
It's my pleasure to introduce Luke Foster. Luke is a political theorist, assistant professor of political science at Hillsdale, DC, and a good friend of the Center for the last couple of years. Luke did his graduate studies at the Committee in Social Thought at the University of Chicago, where he wrote his dissertation on the education of elites in the United States. He is now working on a book project entitled Beyond Meritocracy, The Pursuit of Excellence in America. His research has been published in journals such as the Tocqueville Review, American Political Thought, the Political Science Reviewer, and Laws. And I had the chance to meet Luke last year for a conference about perspectives on Latin American political thought and constitutionalism. So we're lucky to have a scholar with such wide breadth. And his talk today is entitled Dueling Visions for Elite Education Reform, Benjamin Rush, Thomas Jefferson, and the American University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Luke Foster.
Thanks very much. I've done the technology right here. Thanks very much to Philip, to Cecilia, and to the CSLD for having me here in Madison. As Philip mentioned, I've gotten to do a couple things with the CSLD before, but I've never gotten to see your lovely campus here in the frigid depths of February. But I felt very much at home since I now live on Capitol Hill in the shadow of one legislative dome. It's nice to have another just down the street. I should also say that I'm conscious that I'm speaking in a law faculty, and there may be some lawyers in the room, and I do touch on constitutional law obliquely, but I hope you will forgive me a little bit of license in interpreting that quite broadly, and not pretending to actually know anything about your subject. Why look at Benjamin Rush and Thomas Jefferson? Well, first of all, because both of them understand that educational theory, educational practice, really the civic role of universities like this one is actually part of the constitutional order in a broader sense. Right? That the constitutions are not simply formal mechanisms for dispute resolution or institutions, but they also include things like habits, practices, virtues, perhaps, right? Things that actually come down into the soul of the individual and of our civic life together. So Rush is very grandiose in his language about this. Rush is probably most familiar today as the Surgeon General of the Continental Army during the War of Independence. He's one of the leading figures of that second tier founding fathers, if you will. Not quite a household name, but extremely thoughtful in his own right. So he says, in 1787, this is part of the build-up to the Constitutional Convention, part of the pamphlet wars over the faults of the Articles of Confederation that will lead to the Constitutional Convention gathering in Philadelphia. And he says, the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. Nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to establish and perfect our new forms of government and to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens for these forms. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it turns out Rush was interested in this broader problem of education, how to run a republic, what I like to call the tension between equality, the principle of the equality of citizens before the law, and excellence, right? The fact that not everyone has the same capacities, talents, training, experience, and therefore there's a need for particular forms of excellence to be provided for and cultivated in public office. Well, Rush goes to the maximalist position. He calls for a national federal university, and he's a federalist, he wants a much stronger central government than the Articles have. And he wants eligibility for all federal office to be dependent on graduating from the national university. So this is, if you will, like the most literal maximalist version. There's plenty of come in. The most literal maximalist version of there should be some connection between elite preparation, education, and public service. And he insists, the custom of turning men out of power or office as soon as they're qualified for it has been found to be as absurd in practice as it is virtuous in speculation. So the background here is that PA, Pennsylvania, had one of the most radically democratic constitutions from the 1770s. There was one unicameral legislature in which basically all power was concentrated, and very, very short terms for representatives in that assembly. And Rush has been involved for 10 years in fights over this, with Thomas Paine and others. He insists government is a science and can never be perfect in America until we encourage men to devote not only 3 years, but their whole lives to it. So you want expert delegate theory representatives who are going to speak for the people. And yes, there's a kind of vague popular sovereignty behind it, but he says, the people should never govern directly. So that sets the goalpost pretty far in one direction, right, on what you might think about elite education, popular rule. Lest this sound like a merely sort of arcane, forgotten debate from the 1780s, I think there are actually versions of it that are very much matters of current public debate, right? Both sides of the political spectrum are, I think, worried in different ways about elite influence in politics, its connection to higher education, right? To use a somewhat, to pick on Harvard as an unfair microcosm, right? You might think both of these images are sort of stereotypical worries you might have about Harvard graduates. One tends to be characteristic of the left. These are the Winklevoss brothers, made famous by The Social Network, right? So the kind of the fraternity brothers who go into industry and acquire a lot of money and are jocks, right? That's one worry. We heard about that more in the Occupy Wall Street era, but I think that's still current on the left. And on the right, you have worries about radical student activism, campus protests, taking over civil discourse, blocking out free speech, etc. Right? This is from last year over the Gaza war, but you could multiply examples. And so, I think it's interesting to try to understand, what are the roots of our system of elite education? What are the different paradigms that we've inherited in America? And in some ways, perhaps we've inherited an incoherent mixture of paradigms. What's interesting about looking at Rush and Jefferson together is that they don't simply map onto a left-right binary today. I think you do get a sense of an institutional spectrum, two quite different models of what a university could look like. And then at the end, I'll try to suggest ways in which understanding their paradigms help us understand kind of our present choices, the possibilities, the things you might try to do to reform higher education if you're worried about concentrations of elite power that is perhaps irresponsible or disconnected from the people and their concerns. So let's deal with Rush in a little more detail for a moment, and then I'll turn to Jefferson. So Rush's broader theory of education is very much tied to his understanding of Republican virtue, the civic practices that republics need to function. And most of his work, other than that salvo about the National University, which in a weird way, everybody in the founding generation agreed on having a national university and no one did it, for various reasons. Go into that in Q&A if you like. Most of Rush's thinking was focused on the Pennsylvania state system, probably of most relevance to public universities today. He wants, he thinks that a democratic republic requires a common demos and therefore a relatively homogeneous set of cultural linguistic assumptions. So he says, our schools of learning, by producing one general and uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government. In context, actually, he's thinking particularly about high concentrations of German speakers in Western PA, and he wants them to go to English-speaking schools and learn English and become, quote-unquote, like us. This is a little image of the core of Dickinson College, which is the institution that Rush was most closely involved with founding. This essay, the Thoughts upon the Mode of Education in a Republic, lays out a whole schema, right? And it's interesting, he's quite institutionally sensitive. He thinks about the funding structure. So it's going to be tiered. There's a publicly funded free school for every 100 families. Every county is going to have an academy, the equivalent of a high school. There will then be 4 colleges in the 4 corners of Pennsylvania, and then 1 state university. Each of these is supposed to be sustained by grants of public land. So you have an interesting anticipation kind of the land grant college model of the late 19th century, which is supposed to make them independent day to day, right? The state legislature doesn't need to constantly be voting them new funds, even though they're publicly, they're accountable to part of the public system. And interestingly, right, Rush remains, despite having this sort of quite bold scheme for universal public education to a certain low level, he remains quite elitist about the overall purposes of education and its limits, right? He certainly does not think everyone should go to college. And he insists later in his life, in 1810, should learning become universal, it will be as destructive to civilization as universal barbarism. So there's a strong insistence here on quality, on the fact that you cannot diffuse a good to everybody and keep it as high a standard. That's the overarching paradigm. Now, his theory of Republican virtue is quite striking in the 18th century, because he's picking up on this whole long fight with people like Montesquieu about whether you can go back to the ancient world and recover ancient civic virtue, right? The kind of thing that Athens, Sparta, turns out he especially praises Sparta, supposedly possessed. The ability to make citizens sacrifice for the common good. And whereas some people said that Christianity had completely changed the possibilities for republics, that you couldn't have the kind of unification of civic and religious authority that produces this kind of devotion under modern conditions. That's Montesquieu's position, for instance. Rush insists that Christianity goes together with republicanism. And so the core claim, and this is Rembrandt's Prodigal Son, right? The core claim is man is naturally an ungovernable animal. When we add the restraints of ecclesiastical to those of domestic and civil government, we produce in him the highest degrees of order and virtue. Without religion, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. Every precept of the gospel inculcates those degrees of humility, self-denial, and brotherly kindness which are directly opposed to the pride of monarchy and the pageantry of a court. He also insists somewhere else that no Christian can fail to be a Republican. So there's a very strong integration between these regimes, or between the religious regime and the civic regime, if you will. And therefore he wants even higher education, right, even up to that state university level, to be administered by or entrusted to particular religious denominations. He says it doesn't really matter which, but they do need to have a strong ecclesial spirit. They should be boarding schools, right? So community life, residential life should be integrated with what's going on in the classroom. You shouldn't just be able to commute or live at home, because it's all about forming you into a comprehensive sense of virtuous character to be capable of exercising public office. So this comes out very clearly as he concludes this essay, Thoughts upon the Mode of Education. He insists the pupil does not belong to himself, but is public property, right? And so all of these communal, civic, residential practices at school are supposed to teach you that you're not an individual. You can't just study whatever you like, pursue whatever you like. There's a very sharply structured common curriculum with lots of memorization, which, by the way, Rush knows is often going to produce ministers. These colleges are that he's talking about in this period are often functioning seminaries as well. And again, it's an elite project. The university is to form the necessary and leading members of the Republic, a great part of the divines, lawyers, physicians, legislators, soldiers, generals, delegates, counselors, and governors of the state. So you see a consistent thread here, right? He's not quite as extreme in saying that all federal office, eligibility for federal office should depend on graduating from the federal university, but you still have a very close link between high office, leadership in the Republic, and having gone through this intense process of kind of unlearning individualistic private habits and becoming devoted to civic things. Right? And this image here, this is by Benjamin West, the great 18th century American painter that Rush would have certainly known. This is Regulus returning to Carthage in the Punic Wars, being willing to give up his life rather than have Rome go through a bad peace deal for his sake. Right? So this is the kind of image of being willing to shed one's own blood for the common thing that Rush is endorsing as an educational model, right? As the goal of education in some ways. Well, Jefferson, unsurprisingly, is very different. Jefferson is writing at the same time, in the mid-1780s, his great work, The Notes on the State of Virginia, which is his kind of competing plan, right? Rush gives the Pennsylvania plan. Jefferson sketches out what he thinks Virginia ought to be doing about education. Similarly, there's universal elementary public education for only 3 years in this case. Then there's going to be 20 grammar schools, which have a kind of humanistic classical side. They will teach Greek, Latin, and geography, and the higher branches of arithmetic. And then there'll be publicly provided scholarships for the brightest poor boy. These are boys' schools in each of the 20 grammar schools. And Jefferson, this is the way where we get a lot of the language of social mobility, of social advancement through education. Jefferson says, by this means 20 of the best geniuses we raked from the rubbish annually. and so those 20, most of them are supposed to be Half of them are supposed to teach at the grammar schools themselves, keep the humanistic stuff going on. But the best 10 are going to go on to William & Mary, the only university in the state to study the sciences. Right? So it's already you're seeing emerge a system we can call anachronistically slightly a meritocracy, right? Where demonstrated ability, especially in scientific research, is the best coin, the highest value currency educationally. And we're clearly the research scientists rule the roost, even if there is some attention paid to the humanities at a slightly lower level. This is all tied in with Jefferson's theory of the natural aristocracy, which again I don't think I have time to go into here in great detail, but we can talk about in Q&A if you like. The view is basically that natural talent is widely and randomly distributed, and it is the task of good civic and political institutions to identify it and promote it, right? So he thinks elections are supposed to do that in the political realm, and this system of scholarships and fellowships is supposed to do that in the educational realm. The line is that support for the children of poor families will, quote, avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use if not sought for and cultivated. So that's the vertical elite dimension. What about that universal public education? What actually goes on there? What do people receive? Well, the goal of that, Jefferson thinks, is rendering the people the safe as they are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty. What does that mean? Right? You might think that would entail moral and civic instruction in the task of self-government, learning how to debate, order priorities, coordinate, and genuinely set the tone for public life and public institutions. But no, it's primarily negative, actually. For one thing, it'll be chiefly historical, he says, rather than religious, because at that young stage, religious inquiries will confuse more than they will clarify, right? So you can't, unlike Rush, you can't trust the churches to do this kind of thing, because he says they'll fill people's heads with a sort of muddle of myths and Bible stories that don't actually help them judge politically. History, though, does. In what sense? It's a kind of prophylaxis against the attraction of great men, would-be Caesars, right? Those who would subvert the state through their own ambition. Right? So you're supposed to read your classical history to learn how the Greek and Roman republics fell and were corrupted. History, by apprising them of the past, will enable them to judge of the future. It will avail them of the experience of other times and other nations. It will qualify them as judges of the actions and designs of men. It will enable them to know ambition under every guise it may assume, and knowing it to defeat its views. But notice, there's a serious tension here with the idea also that public elections, the widespread franchise, is supposed to help elevate talent and promote the best people into politics. Because if the primary upshot of what you've learned in school is anybody who wants to be great or who promises to do great things for people ultimately is in it for themselves and wants to emerge as a tyrant, you're going to incline towards a mode of political debate, of a vision of politics which is very circumspect, has very low horizons, low ambitions. And so, in a funny way, Jefferson does not succeed in reconciling, I think, the highly elite-driven, find rarefied scientific talent and promote it as fast and as effectively as possible, and this, but watch out for those who promise great things in politics view. Right? And I'll come back to that. Now, this is jumping forward more than 30 years in Jefferson's life. William and Mary, he decides, is a shambles. It'll never be the great university for Virginia that he wanted it back in the notes. He also actually supports the federal university ideal, but he thinks you need a constitutional amendment to build one. He never gets that passed. He allows Hamilton to set up West Point, which is a kind of national university, if you will, but he's suspicious of professional military officers, so he never gives that funding as president. So 30 years later, when he's retired from his time in Washington, he works with James Madison and others to draw up plans for the University of Virginia. And the Rockfish Gap Report is the great text we have on their founding vision. Again, certainly elitist hierarchical understanding that the excellences of rule and leadership are going to require a special education. So this is the early quad of UVA, and Rockfish Gap says the school is going to form the statesmen, legislators, and judges on whom public prosperity, individual happiness are so much to depend. Notice, by the way, that divines, ministers, dropped out of Rush's list. So it's definitely not going to have that seminary clerical spirit. And it's going to have ethical, political content in the curriculum, clearly, right? He says they say we're going to teach the principles and structure of government and a sound spirit of legislation, which banishing all arbitrary and unnecessary restraint of individual action shall leave us free to do whatever does not violate the equal rights of another. So it's an interesting kind of ethical, political substance to the curriculum because it's as liberal in the sense of allowing free individual choice as possible. And yet, Jefferson and Madison actually have these letters together where they discuss very carefully, should we allow our Federalist political opponents to have their text in the curriculum, maybe one or two, but we have to really carefully think through who the sources are in law and politics so that they don't become monarchists, they say, which is their term for Federalists. There's a tension here, a profound one, right, between saying education is about equipping, empowering individual liberty, and saying, in the more Rushian way, education is about preparing leaders to be morally worthy of serving. And again, I don't think it's ever fully worked out in these early years of UVA. Microcosm of this. Jefferson insists that there's going to be very little coercive discipline in the university. And this way it seems very modern, very, very contemporary, right? There's not going to be a lot of faculty involvement in student government. Students are going to have their own self-governance, elect their own officers. There's going to be an honor system for honesty and to prevent cheating. And things like expulsion or certainly turning students over to the public authority, to the law, as opposed to dealing with problems internally, absolutely out, Jefferson says. So the model is to be the affectionate deportment between father and son, which offers in truth the best example for that of tutor and pupil. So the university is going to nourish the combined spirit of order and self-respect so important to be woven into the American character. In other words, right, you're grown-ups and we're going to treat you as such. Right? Why would we surveil you and punish you to make you into something you're not, right? To mold you in our own image. That's supposedly the pedagogical vision. Okay. The university opened its doors in March 1825. And many of the first professors were scientists, other experts from Europe, many of whom had funny accents. They seemed foreign to the sons of Virginia planters who were most of the initial students. And as this medieval image indicates, right, student riots are a very long tradition. High spirits and alcohol and student rivalries can produce powerful things. But Jefferson was shocked when his great-nephew and a bunch of his friends put masks on, got very drunk, and started throwing bricks through the windows of the foreign professors' rooms, and threatening to beat them up. Jefferson trying to have totally minimally coercive government of student life, totally switches course. He gathers the board of visitors, so he's very old. This is less than a year before he dies. He gathers Madison and the others. They come in their full regalia, invoking sort of all of the grandeur and the dignity of the heroes of the Revolution. They arraign the students. Jefferson weeps. He breaks down in tears before them with his grave disappointment at how terrible they've been. He has his own nephew expelled and turned over to the law, actually, for civil punishment. All these things he said he would never do. The professors are empowered as wardens of the dormitories, where they can go around and check on what students are doing late at night and write them up. And a month later, Jefferson writes to his granddaughter, very pleased. So, perfect subordination has succeeded, entire respect toward the professors, and industry, order, and quiet, the most exemplary, has prevailed ever since. So this is to say, there's a certain duality. Maybe we could even push it and say a schizophrenic quality to Jefferson's thought and practice at UVA, which is to say, simultaneously, it's supposed to be simultaneously very hierarchical in its understanding of the purpose of education, but giving great weight to individual student freedom in terms of expressing themselves, following their own desires. In fact, it's supposed to be a very open curriculum with lots of electives, which is very unusual for the time. And yet, whenever that encounters a hiccup, there's a tendency for that mode of thinking about hierarchy to actually become very coercive, to come down hard. Arguably in the way that technocracy more generally, if you think about scientific achievement and attainment as the currency of political power, you tend to devalue things like discursive reasoning, deliberation together, forging consensus. You tend to say, well, I know the scientific truth, everyone should obey, right? And so there is, I think, a certain mysterious link actually between the libertarian side of Jefferson and the authoritarian side. Right? Just to give you a quick idea of the distinctive character of UVA compared to Rush's, Dickinson, and other institutions of the time, this is the data we have on where the students in the first half century went. 60% became doctors, lawyers, or planters, but it also produced 2 presidential cabinet members, 62 members and 2 speakers of the U.S. House, 348 state representatives, 167 judges, 30 brigadier generals, 8 state attorneys general, and 5 secretaries of state. Less than 4% became clergy. So again, you see, whereas the clergy were sort of first in Rush's mind, they are just a distinct afterthought at UVA, and that's characteristic of the divergence here. One way to sum all this up actually is, I remember I mentioned that theme of Rush's fascination with Sparta and the civic devotion of the Spartans at the beginning. That dichotomy is another way to sum up the difference between Jefferson and Rush. What they have to say about Spartan education. So this is an image of Leonidas leading the Spartan defense at Thermopylae against the Persians. Rush praises Sparta to the skies, where he says, quote, securing the early attachment of youth to the laws and constitution of their country. Right? He loves this kind of denaturing, uprooting individualism, creating a common loyalty in Spartan training. And therefore, Rush is okay actually with military training as part of the undergraduate curriculum. Jefferson takes quite the opposite approach, characteristically. And he has Sparta and this sort of, creepy total devotion of the Spartans in mind. he says, military exercise with ancient nations constituted the principal part of the education of their youth. Whereas their arms and mode of warfare rendered them severe in the extreme, right? Here again, the Spartans are pictured naked to show their willingness to face the elements, which is hammered into them from a very young age. Ours, on the same correct principle, should be adapted to our arms and warfare, by which he means, well, we do things voluntarily in America. There shouldn't be a national or professional military. At most, there should be state and local militias. And so if some UVA students want to set up a voluntary club where they drill on the quad, they can do that, but we're not going to require it. So again, it's just a microcosm of the broader dichotomy. I submit to you that neither side in this dispute is fully satisfying. Right? You can see ways in which we still have these kind of debates today, right? One set of them is over the power of state legislatures to set curricular requirements, right? Can political authorities oblige public universities to teach or not teach certain things, right? Does that violate the freedom of students and teachers to pursue their own interests and discover the truth as they see fit? For example, right? So you could set up a sort of a binary spectrum here of a binary dichotomy here between coercion by the public authorities to know and internalize certain things versus individual freedom. But that, I think, is a reductive, kind of uninteresting binary in a way. The more interesting alternative in the same founding generation, I think, is actually John Adams, who frustratingly never wrote a full treatise on education, never was as involved with founding a school the way that Rush and Jefferson were. So we don't have his thought fully fleshed out. But what we do have are his letters to his children, and especially to John Quincy, his eldest, and his kind of his pride and joy in this regard. So this is a wonderful letter during Adams' diplomatic service during the Revolutionary War. He's gone off to the court of the Russian court in St. Petersburg, and he's left John Quincy, who's 14, behind in the Netherlands. And he's writing him anxious letters saying, please do your homework. You go on, I presume, with your Latin exercises, and I wish to hear of your beginning upon Sallust. He was one of the most polished and perfect of the Roman historians, every period of whom, and I'd almost said every syllable and every letter, is worth studying. In company with Sallust, Cicero, Tacitus, and Livy, you will learn wisdom and virtue. You will see them represented with all the charms which language and imagination can exhibit, and vice and folly painted in all their deformity and horror. You will ever remember that all the end of study is to make you a good man and a useful citizen. This will ever be the sum total of the advice of your affectionate father. You can imagine, probably young John Quincy stood up a little straighter and worked a little harder that day. But behind this is a very ancient, long-standing view of the purpose of especially humanistic education, right? Which is to form your affections, train the desires, by giving you noble exemplars to imitate, that capture your imagination and make you long to be like them, and also negative, base counterexamples that are meant to repulse you. This is why, by the way, that until the 19th century, history writing does not aspire to be scientific or neutral. Right? It actually aspires to give you good moral lessons. And so the historians try to move you, and they often use what we now think of as purple prose, sort of overly poetic language. But there's no sense that history writing is a value-neutral, purely fact-based discipline. That's the tradition that Adams is drawing on. That I would suggest offers a way of avoiding some of the pitfalls of both Rush and Jefferson. So, by way of conclusion, let me say something about how these different models have come down to the present, ways in which we can sort of see them operative in the good and bad of what we experience in higher education, especially higher education at an ambitious, talented, prestigious place like this one. Right? There are at least three different strands operating in our regular experience. The Rushian descended view is that education is supposed to give us discipline in order to govern, right? You need to govern yourself, govern the passions, in order to be able to govern in public life. This is the origin of, in loco parentis, the idea that colleges stand legally and judicially in the place of parents and can exercise coercive authority over students if need be. And this is also the sort of the seminary college, which was very widespread through the 19th century in America and still survives in different places. But most great universities have an aspect, have a college or a undergraduate focused aspect which has some of this in it. The second sort of title to rule, criterion of elite status, if you will, that comes from Jefferson, is demonstrable prowess along a scientific continuum. In other words, the more you can prove that you really have the ability to solve and reason through scientific problems and produce scientific research, scientific technology especially, then you get elite status and eventually political influence, right? And this is really, in some ways, the legacy of the research university. This is cemented and accelerated in the 20th century by standardized testing, right? Which reflected underlying assumption that academic intellectual prowess is one thing. We can measure it, and we can reliably rank people based on where they stand according to a number. Right? The third one, which is really from Adams, in America at least, is that higher education is primarily about imitation of exempla, making ourselves like great precedents. This is related to the idea of the great books tradition, things like integrated liberal studies, things like having a common core curriculum, which is supposed to not actually respond to the desires or interests of individual students, but provide a common vocabulary that everybody internalizes, whether they want to or not, right? But that's not primarily or overtly moral formation according to a community's norms. It's buying into a set of intellectual models, and often literary, poetic models are important here. And I would suggest, by way of closing, that this third Adams-derived model is most helpful for thinking about the relationship between elites and people today, because it's only with this third one that you get an understanding of political rhetoric, where you get the resources to make speeches that are moving, powerful, inspiring, but that are intelligible to, capable of being heard by ordinary people who don't have the same education. Right? The pitfall of Russian education is that it can prioritize the community too much, and can genuinely stifle, I think, the capacity to become great and to lead well. Right? We can make the leaders too much like the overarching community. Right? The pitfall of the Jeffersonian one is you get technocracy, you get leaders, elites who are almost unintelligible to their fellow citizens, right? In the way that spitting a bunch of scientific papers at someone doesn't persuade them, right? Unless they are a party to the same guild and have been trained in the same vocabulary you have been. But if you want, Washingtonian, Lincolnian, Martin Luther Kingian, Churchillian rhetoric, if you want these kind of seminal moments of statesmanship in our tradition to be revived, and you want like good debate in Congress that can also push back on and criticize executive power, you need rhetoric. And you need, I think, this kind of lead education, which does believe in a certain kind of hierarchy, right? Is willing to say certain modes of study or ways of life are higher than others. But at the same time, it creates the capacity for communication between high and low. So you're not stuck with antagonism and mutual contempt, which is, I worry, something like where we are today. So I think I will leave it there, and we have some time for questions, I believe. Thank you. Should I just field questions directly? Yeah.
Yes.
Please. And please maybe give me your name and what you're studying.
I'm Joel. I'm a law student here. I'm kind of curious if you could expand on how West Point fits into all of this, because like I see elements of like all of these ideas there. And it really was the military in general was a defining political sort of stepping stone for the first half of our country's history, but has dramatically changed within the past like 50 years or so.
Right.
So I'm sort of curious to see how that fits into this. What facilitated that change, and what does that say about these ideas in the present day?
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. Well, first I should say, a deep dive into the history of West Point and these debates is a forthcoming research project that I haven't done yet. So I can give you my broad sense, and please hold my feet to the fire in a couple of years if I haven't gotten that done. But broadly speaking, Hamilton wants a professional, permanent officer corps who are going to be educated in the European style, especially the Napoleonic, what's becoming the Napoleonic mode already in the early 1800s. Jefferson is very opposed to that because Jefferson doesn't want a professional permanent army. He much prefers to rely on state militias, with the partial exception of the Navy, right? And the Naval Academy, basically, Federalists and Republicans tended to agree that naval officers required scientific expertise. You had to know things like ballistics and navigation. There was no way around that. But the question was that also true of land army knowledge? And broadly speaking, West Point remains very small and minimally funded until the 1830s, when in the build-up to the Mexican-American War and then the Civil War, West Point starts to expand. And there the engineers are always the most prestigious students. You might remember that Robert E. Lee, for instance, is an engineering graduate, and the Army Corps of Engineers, because of the expansion of the railroad system, has a lot of political power throughout the 19th century. So there actually is definitely a kind of technocratic aspect to West Point education throughout. But they certainly read ancient history. They read classics until post-World War II. And then you start to see, I think, a real decline in humanistic formation among the military academy graduates, which may have something to do with the fact that Eisenhower is the last general elected president, right? He's a product of pre-World War II West Point, if you will. And it's not as much that military-industrial complex vision of the service academies, which Eisenhower famously was worried about in his farewell address. So I suspect there's a story to be told there, and maybe by way of ending that answer, I can say part of Eisenhower's statesmanship is his experience in the 1920s on the American Battlefield Monuments Commission. So he was one of the senior people responsible as a young officer for setting up the memorials to the American war dead in France after World War I. And so he learned French well. He made many French friends. And when World War II rolls around, it becomes particularly important because de Gaulle and FDR couldn't get along at all. But Eisenhower could respect de Gaulle. He understood something of that kind of Gallic pride that de Gaulle had, they could actually get along such that Eisenhower ensured that France was not treated as a defeated occupied power, but as a victorious ally, which I would suggest did a lot of good for the post-war order. So we're still benefiting from this older understanding of military statesmanship, even if it's not well taught now. More questions? Yes. What's your name? What do you do?
Oh, yeah, my name is Mike Goodman. I'm a retired ABD from the history department here. My question is, why was the concept of a national university gradually abandoned? And in that regard, I think it's interesting that John Quincy Adams even wanted funding for a national observatory, but I guess that was regarded as far ahead for its time.
Yeah, so well, what does happen is the Smithsonian, which is actually under the Jefferson administration. There are, I believe, some archives and libraries trying to escape France under Napoleon that Jefferson is willing to house in D.C. at relatively low cost, right? According to his he was a strict constructionist and a small government guy, except when he could do something opportunistically. And so the Smithsonian was one case. So there is a federal commitment to scientific research and the kind of collection and preservation of knowledge from the early 1800s through that. The best book I've read on the National University Project says that no one ever argued the idea down completely. It remains there through the Quincy Adams administration. Jackson certainly wouldn't have been favorable to it. But it keeps bubbling for decades until basically the Benjamin Rush model attracts, is successful, essentially. There's so many of these little seminary colleges on the Dickinson model founded in the first half of the 19th century, especially in the northern states, that the momentum for National University dissipates. And so it's not like anybody ever categorically rejected the idea. It's just that funding and energy was spent elsewhere. Relatedly, though, I think it was also that a national university would have had to be non-sectarian, and nobody could agree on what that would look like. Right? Whereas state colleges and even publicly funded ones could work out compromises on the religious politics of the day in ways that at federal level were impossible. Because, for instance, even Rush, in that early call for a federal university, says this one would have to have no church involvement. But there he's assuming that everyone at the federal university would have gone through one of his state colleges and gotten that good ecclesiastical governance early on, such that they wouldn't be morally depraved by the time they go on to study it at the really what would be the equivalent of graduate level at the federal level. More questions? Yes, please.
What's your
And
assessment?
please, who are you? What do you do?
Oh, my name is Maggie. I work on campus. So,
Awesome.
So what's your assessment of how American universities are functioning in the Republic against the Founding Fathers' vision right now?
As in, where's kind of the balance sheet at present?
I mean, it seems like you presented them like visions of Founding Fathers and how a university should, how they contribute to the country, and what's your assessment of how the American university system's doing that right now?
Yeah, well, this is a small, easy question, but I'll try to take a stab at some aspects of it. I think the first thing to say is there is genuinely transmission inheritance of these founding visions, right? Part of what I'm trying to argue is that institutions like this one, the institutions that have formed us and that we're all part of, are a kind of patchwork of these different impulses. Neither Rush nor Jefferson won completely. Adams certainly didn't win, but neither have their ideas died completely. And so part of what can be both beautiful and frustrating about being part of American higher ed today is that it's not fully philosophically, theoretically coherent, right? The term coined by a chancellor of the University of California system in the 60s was the multiversity, right? Like, we shouldn't be aspiring to a university where there's one coherent, overarching principle that connects everything, because it's just the case that some of us do disease control research, some of us work on con law, others of us do stargazing, and there's no, it doesn't have to cohere, right? I think, though, that reflects a kind of a very peculiar environment of post-World War II generous federal funding for universities that assume, federal and state funding, that assumes that the public is going to consistently buy into the fact that these places are serving the public good. And I don't think, it's my read of the way the political winds are blowing is that we in the academy can no longer rely on that public trust and the fact the public is willing to fund higher ed in the same way with no questions asked. And so I think it behooves us to think through the models, think through the overarching unifying principles, and say, what are we trying to achieve here? What do we want our graduates to be? What kind of men and women are they going to live as in the world, so that it's worth the public supporting us and giving us the time and resources to study and teach here? And that strikes me as all the more necessary after the last few weeks of federal funding cuts, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of interesting institutions and people in a whole panoply of ways that are trying to propose models for reform. I'm part of the Alliance for Civics in the Academy, which is one group thinking about instilling civic responsibility and understanding of a common political tradition that graduates are going to have to steward. I think the place where I am now, Hillsdale College, is an interesting small alternative model. Danielle Allen at Harvard has been particularly bothered by some of the Harvard scandals in recent years, and she's tried to develop a whole set of new texts and curricula. So there are a lot of people working on this. I think, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Like, not every initiative is going to work, but if we want some version of the great story of American higher ed to continue, we have to give this some thought.
It's 1 p.m., so that's all the time we have for questions. Please join me in thanking our speaker again. Everyone else, please take another sandwich on your way out. Well, for being here.